Thanks, Greg. And thank you, Dr. Jupiter, for joining us today. This timing is great because in our last week's seminar, Dr. Ben Halpern spoke to the magnitude of the problem of human sewage in coastal ecosystems, among other things, but on a global scale. And now today, we're lucky to have you here to drill further into your work designing an innovative planetary health approach to watershed management that combines nature-based solutions with water and sanitation infrastructure. So a little bit about Stacy as we get started. She's the Melanesia Regional Director for the Wildlife Conservation Society based out of Fiji. She completed her undergrad at Harvard University and her doctoral research at UC Santa Cruz and at the University of Queensland while on a Fulbright scholarship. Stacy first became interested in community-based management and conservation while serving as a Peace Corps rural fisheries volunteer in the tropical rainforests of Gabon in Central Africa. Stacy's work in integrated catchment-to-reef management has taken many forms, including evaluating effectiveness of locally managed marine areas and integrated island management projects, undertaking spatial planning to achieve biodiversity and livelihoods outcomes, assessing downstream impacts of catchment modification on biodiversity and human health, and understanding drivers of resilience in Pacific coastal communities. So with that, welcome, Dr. Jupiter, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Paulina and Greg. It's really great to be here with you all today. I'll just pop up my slides. I apologize in advance if we have any internet technical issues. Sometimes the internet isn't so great. Can everyone see the slides now? Great. Okay, I'll keep going. So yes, I'm super pleased to be talking to you all today about how we've arrived at this systems approach to watershed management for health and well-being co-benefits for nature and people in Fiji and the Pacific. But I want to start with this photo, and I put this up to remind me to tell you that I have some history attached to Arizona, and I'm really sad that I can't be with you in person today because this is a photo of my dad. He was stationed with my mom on the Gila River Reservation as a doctor in the early to mid 70s. And that's kind of my origin story. That's where I was made, and I grew up in my mother's womb smelling the desert air. So it would be nice to go back. I've been back a few times and it's a beautiful part of the world. But jumping back to what I ended up doing, I'm really going to tell you a little bit of a journey, a story about how someone like me who loves coral reefs and the marine environment has ended up being involved in things like a case control study to uncover drivers of the spread of typhoid in Fiji. And you might be asking yourself, what? Did I just hear that correctly? But hopefully, as we go through this tale, you'll see how there are overlaps in coral reef ecology and disease ecology that combine in the environmental setting of watersheds. And this will all come clear in a few minutes, I hope. So I put up this picture of a butterfly in homage to Edward Lorenz, who was the person who really coined that phrase, the butterfly effect, thinking about how a disturbance in one system could create faraway impacts in another system. And I've always had this interest in this connectivity between different systems and how actions in one place could affect faraway places. So, there's no proven evidence necessarily that a butterfly's flapping wings is going to cause a storm somewhere else. But there is lots of good evidence about how human activities in particular are having, in this case, when we talk about a watershed context, downstream impacts in faraway ecosystems. And I started working on this, as Paulina alluded to, when I was doing my PhD through UC Santa Cruz, also through the University of Queensland. And I was working in Australia with a team trying to look at these histories of land clearing within the watersheds of the catchments or watersheds of the South Central Great Barrier Reef. And through this project, we uncovered these series of events that led to long-term changes in water quality that ultimately we could link to impacts on the downstream marine environment. We were able to track this change actually through looking at proxies that we measured within long-lived coral skeletons, so trace metal proxies of sediments and isotopic proxies of nutrients. And through this, we were able to see that following the initial arrival of European settlers in around the 1860s in this particular area, there was about a 37% increase in sediment delivery. We were also able to trace land-based nutrients from the changes that were happening through the catchments, this signature out into the nearshore reefs. And actually there's a paper that's just come out 15 years after the fact. So if any of you are still working on your PhDs and have, or to finish and have data sitting around, it can be done. You can get these things out 15 years later. Just takes a bit of motivation. Then we're also able to document some potential phase shifts in the reefs, particularly about 30 kilometers offshore, that were influenced, we think, by this pretty large flood event in 1990. So in doing this and doing PhD and postdoc work in Australia, I learned a lot about these systems and how different human disturbances and activities in the catchment change the quality and nature of the water that's getting out to the near shore and what happens to it when it gets into the marine environment. But I always had the intention that I wanted to take this knowledge and these skills to go work with an environmental conservation organization to be able to put this knowledge into management practice. And that opportunity came up in 2008 when I left Australia and joined the Wildlife Conservation Society in Fiji. I initially joined as a conservation scientist then, and then I quickly took over running our Fiji program, which I ran for a number of years after that. And when I arrived in Fiji, WCS, along with a number of different NGO and university partners, were implementing this ecosystem-based management project on Fiji's second largest island of Vanuatu. So this photo is just standing on one of the kind of close ridge tops, looking down on one of the villages in Kumbalau district, which was the focus of WCS's initial work through this project and out to the reef. And in the mid-2000s, that term ecosystem-based management was kind of all the rage. In the conservation sector, there's a new buzzword like every month, like an ice cream flavor of the month. I think this month, conservation flavor of the month is nature-based solutions. It's all kind of, you're doing the same thing, just the terminology changes. But what the marine community was really talking about in the mid-2000s through ecosystem-based management was to try to encourage managers in particular to get out of the silos where they work in, whether that's the ecosystem that they have to protect or the different sector that they're involved in, and think about this connectivity between ecological processes and manage at the scale that these ecological processes happen, and also manage at the scale that the disturbances are happening and their impacts. And it's a pretty hard thing to do, to get people to get outside of their sectoral silos, particularly because there's often a legal mandate for agencies that they have to work within those boundaries. And if there's not some sort of coordination agency with a legal mandate to bring people together, this often falls apart and people go back to working in their silos. A perfect example of this is, looking back in Australia, the Great Barrier Marine Park Authority, they are supposed to be implementing this water quality protection plan, but they have no legal jurisdiction over any of the activities that happen in the catchment. So you can see that there's a big disconnect here. But in the Pacific Islands, there actually are unique opportunities to be able to work directly with managers who have some authority over what happens on the linked land and sea areas. And that's because where we work in Melanesia, so I cover the programs in Fiji and Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and we work a bit in Vanuatu. And Indigenous people in these countries have land tenure over about 87 to 98% of all of the land in the country. And they also have customary marine tenure or use and access rights of adjacent fishing grounds. So in small island areas, it's the same people who have decision-making authority over what happens on the land, as well as who can access and use the marine environment. So if this is at a large enough scale, it offers the perfect opportunity that people actually have a great deal of say and can manage over the scale at which ecological processes are happening and manage the threats. Pacific peoples also have great cultural incentives to want to be managing natural resources because their cultural practice is really intimately tied to the state of the environment and natural resources. This is a picture from Papua New Guinea from a cultural performance, and you can see every bit of their costumes is taken from the natural environment, from the feathers and the headdresses, from the birds to the shells and the necklaces and the ornamentation. And so in order to undertake cultural practice, people have to be able to find and use these the resources and the animals and the plants from the environment, and thus the decision making is incentivized largely because people want to, and they want their future generations to be able to continue this type of cultural practice, which doesn't just involve getting dressed up in certain costumes. It also involves, for example, sharing fish for feasts and lots of food in times of feast. And to be able to have any status, you have to be able to accumulate these sorts of resources. So when I first arrived, jumping back to Fiji now, in Fiji and working with WCS, what I found is that the way the team was thinking about doing management in this system, working with the communities of Kumbalau district, was a bit piecemeal. They weren't necessarily thinking of these connections between the land and sea. There was a draft management plan for a marine protected area. There was a draft management plan for the entire fishing ground, and they weren't connected. And then there was a separate draft management plan for a forest area upstream. So I decided we needed to shake up this process a little bit and actually really specifically think about those connections. And so we brought everyone together, had a very participatory consultative process with representatives from all of the 10 villages, as well as different government sectors, different partner organizations that came together to outline what are the values from these different systems that the local community was interested in maintaining. And then what are the main threats to these areas and what could they do themselves? And then what are the other rules and what are the other actions where they would need assistance? And so that resulted in the production of Fiji's first district level ridge to reef management plan, or ecosystem-based management plan. It contains rules that the communities set themselves, that they agreed to self-regulate for management of these different ecosystems. And then we also included in the plan, what are the different national regulations that would apply to these ecosystems? Because in most cases, even though there are some good rules that exist, people aren't aware of them, particularly in rural parts of Fiji or in other countries in the Pacific. And so now this type of planning, with WCS, our teams, they've replicated across, I think, 9 different districts now in Fiji, 2 separate islands across one whole province. And what I've noticed over almost 15 years of doing this is while local communities are pretty willing to put in place the marine management rules and implement them, they haven't really changed their behavior on the land. And this is despite the fact that we have accumulated quite a lot of evidence that certain behaviors and actions on the land are creating downstream impacts. So I just want to show you a little bit about the types of evidence and the science that we've been doing to try to convince people to think about behavior change. So when I first got there, the first data that we started looking at were about impacts to freshwater fish communities. And that's because my colleague, Aaron Jenkins, who was then running Wetlands International Oceania Office, he had already accumulated a database of freshwater fish records from watersheds all around Fiji, not just where we were working in Kumbalau. And what we found was that the freshwater fish species richness was affected by the amount of forest cover and the presence of tilapia. So where there was lowest forest cover, there were fewer fish and lower species richness. And this is also negatively influenced by tilapia. Mechanistically, I mean, we don't have the evidence to say, but there are many ways that tilapia, which was introduced in Fiji, could be affecting the fish. They bioturbate, they stir up sediment on the bottom. They might be eating the larvae or the small fish, or they just, they're really hardy. They can survive in mud for days. So maybe they just are the only ones left when conditions are really bad. We also found that there were distinct seasonal differences in freshwater fish communities when we looked at watersheds that were more pristine versus ones that were very disturbed. So in the pristine watersheds during the rainy season, we would actually see more fish and a higher diversity of fish. And that's because you would get more water coming down, the creeks were wider, and there's more habitable space. But when you looked on the other side of the island in the degraded catchments, the rain brings down a lot more sediments and associated pollutants into the water. And so we would see a lot fewer fish and a lower diversity of fish. And the fish that were most particularly affected and sensitive were ones that have this amphibious life history, which means that they're born in freshwater and then they have to go out to sea as larvae. They spend a few weeks out at sea and then they come back up. And so they're making this migration along the entire pathway of the river and out to the marine environment. And so there's a high chance that they might come across different types of human disturbance that would affect them. The kind of fish that have this life history category are in particular gobies and gudgeons. Some of the gudgeons can be, nearly plate size, and the gobies come back up in this mass migration, and they're caught. You can get a lot of money for them, basically. So particularly for inland communities, these fish groups are ones that are really important for their food and livelihood. We are also very interested in tracking impacts to downstream reef environment. So we look not just in Fiji, but also in places like Solomon Islands, where commercial logging accounts for about 18% of government GDP and then the revenue, and then at least 60% of the export revenue, but it's very, very poorly regulated due to high levels of corruption. So any sort of evidence that we can show of downstream impacts associated with logging could potentially help in the fight to try to better regulate the unregulated illegal logging that's happening there. So we've done some types of modeling, and we've linked that to actual data that we've collected on the ground. The first type of modeling in Solomons that we did was looking at this island, which is Collaborators Island in Western Province. The top of the mountain is still forested above 400 meters. And the name in the local language, Collaborators, actually means water lord, because it has a cloud forest and it collects all of the water that's feeding down the 80 different rivers. That's really the water supply for the 6,000 people that live around the island. And what we found, we were interested to see whether or not it mattered if this area was going to get cleared. We're trying to set up a protected area on the top. And so this information is to try to motivate people to agree for the protected area. And there's logging, people trying to get at these trees all the time. So what we're showing is that even if logging happens, if it gets up to a certain extent, it doesn't even matter if people are actually using best practice logging, that downstream, the safe drinking water levels would be exceeded nearly 40% of the time. And currently there are issues with the quality of water in terms of its safety at the moment. So this is information that we can take back to convince the landowners to think about agreeing to the protected area and not allowing the clearing to go ahead. So we also then linked using these same models and then linking them to our downstream coral reef records to see if we can link what's happening on the land to the sea. And the story is pretty similar, not exactly the same of what we've observed at displaced in the Solomons and what we've seen on Waterrelated in Fiji. We found that live coral cover is affected by what's happening on the land. In this case, in the Solomons, it is the distance from the log ponds. Log ponds are where they take the logs on the coast and then they log them onto barges. And there's a lot of kind of sediment resuspension because of all the sloshing that happens during the loading process. The coral has also been related to this proportional difference in sediment exposure. So we modeled how much sediment would have been coming down before any land clearing started versus what is anticipated is coming down at the pour points of the rivers now based on the current amount of land clearing. Similarly, we found that that variable also strongly influenced the amount of turf algae. And we found that areas of higher sedimentation had fewer grazing fish. And then we coupled this with our catch records, which show that the grazers comprise in this place about a quarter of the catch and about 40% of the catch sold. So again, this is suggesting that these are that land-based activities are having downstream impacts on fish that people really care about, both for food and income. And we saw similar type results in Fiji. So we've taken this information back to decision makers. This is a picture from Collaborators. This is woman here on the left is Amelia Wenger, who led a lot of that modeling of the land clearing on Collaborators. We presented it back to the landowners and to try to get agreement on this protected area. We've tried to communicate the information other ways. I've, for example, worked with a local comic book artist to produce a story of what happens to those amphibious fish when they try to come back up in their migration and they're influenced by all these human activities. We had puppets made. We took them on a road show to schools all across Waterrelated. And, you know, it triggered interest from the students. And they, right after, we heard stories that they would tell their teachers, oh, teacher, your gardens are planted too close to the stream. You have to move them. We didn't necessarily see any sort of trickle up effect to their parents in terms of influencing their decision in terms of not leasing their land to logging. So we're still seeing, I guess you could say, well, it's decision-making, whether it's poor or not, it's people's choices, but it is decision-making that is compromising water quality and it's compromising their downstream fisheries and marine ecosystems. So really trying to think about, well, okay, telling people that it's affecting their food sources, their fish isn't enough. What is enough to change people's behavior? And this was the first trigger to start thinking about alternative ways to influence behavior change. So this picture was from a flood in Fiji and from 2009. I actually was flying back from Hawaii to Fiji from a holiday. And this is basically what I saw from the plane when we came down through the clouds, and I saw this and said a much worse thing in my head than, oh crap, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to get home that night. But my problems were nothing compared to the 8,500 people who were left homeless from this event. There's about $300 million worth of damage to infrastructure. And then what was more insidious was that after this flood and then subsequent floods that were resulting from either tropical depressions or cyclones, we started getting data from the health ministry, seeing these peaks in water-related diseases. This is some data from leptospirosis, which is a zoonotic disease. It's bacteria, but it has to go through animals and animal urine getting into the waterway before it gets into people. We also were seeing peaks in typhoid. And so with, again, my colleague Erin Jenkin, we started thinking, well, it seems like a lot of these impacts are happening, these outbreaks in areas where the watersheds have been highly altered. So what if it's the same drivers of impact that we know are affecting downstream marine and freshwater ecosystems? Wouldn't people be more likely to change their behavior and change their activities on the land if they thought that it could reduce the risk of getting typhoid or leptospirosis? So for about a decade, we tried to pitch this to donors to be able to get funding, to be able to comprehensively investigate this, and then use what we uncovered about the drivers that affect disease risk and overlap that with what we know affects downstream marine ecosystem to implement this kind of integrated management. It was very hard. We couldn't find donors who were willing to invest in everything at once. A lot of donors would say, oh, that's super interesting, but we have an environment program and we have a health program, and we just structurally don't know where to put this. So come back to us in 5 years or so. In the meantime, we thought this was too important to sit on. We couldn't wait to get funding. So Aaron hadn't done his PhD yet. He enrolled himself in Edith Cowan University in Australia to try to look and see if we could uncover any environmental determinants of typhoid in Fiji. And he was focusing specifically in Central Division, which is these watersheds that you see here. And through his research, he did, in fact, uncover, looking at case records, that there were some environmental determinants of Fiji. He was fortunate in that there was a case control study to examine typhoid that was happening at the same time. So we could look at what was influencing typhoid at a whole range of scales. So what was coming out of the case control study wasn't super surprising in terms of drivers. You could see that there was a lack of hand washing and drinking contaminated surface water, and damaged sanitation infrastructure was associated with high risk of typhoid. But from Aaron's work, what we found that was unique was that areas within these watersheds or sub-watersheds that had more erodible soil, bare soil, where the riparian zone was fragmented and where there was a higher density of creek crossings. So when the roads cross the creeks, and in this case, when you're in the rural areas, the roads aren't paved. So it's a place where sediment could get into the waterway. These were all associated with higher incidence of typhoid. And then he looked at the residential village and found certain environmental related things that also contributed to about 40% of the cumulative variance in terms of typhoid risk. So these were things like E. coli, which is an indicator of fecal contamination, and phosphate concentrations in the toilet drainage soil, the external conditions of houses, again, this drinking water contamination, and the sanitary condition of the residences. This photograph on the left, this is kind of indicative of what you would say in a village is high typhoid risk. So this is an outhouse that's sitting here, and then downslope from that, they're growing taro. And so there's likely seepage that would be coming down if there's any bacterial contamination with typhoid, and people are picking their crops from this area, not washing them. That's very high risk for people getting typhoid. So putting all of this information that we have together, what you can see is that in order to really holistically address both disease risk and downstream ecosystem risk, you really need to be looking at factors that are happening at a number of different scales. So both problems are climate related as well. In the Pacific, in particular in Fiji, what we're seeing is that there has been an increase in kind of heavy rainfall events. And that leads to potentially more flooding, and all of this disease, as well as the downstream marine impacts and freshwater impacts, are all associated with flood risk. The only way to tackle that is really through global negotiations, like just happened in Glasgow. So what we can do is we can arm these policy and decision makers with the information to talk about with the real urgency to tackle this, especially for the Pacific Islands. And getting that disease risk information is really important for these types of considerations at the global level. At the landscape level within the watershed, we're focusing very much on protection and restoration. So that's where the new buzzword nature-based solutions comes in, because we're looking at things like riparian restoration, planting trees, planting vetiver grass to stabilize the riverbanks to keep the sediment out. At the village level, we're looking at water and sanitation infrastructure improvements, waste management improvements to try to reduce the chance of that type of bacteria getting into the waterway, and also to reduce those sewage impacts, which we know also have downstream impacts on the reef. There's also an important component of this, that there needs to be improved health surveillance systems, and that's part of what we're working on in our teams as well. And then lastly, the huge component of human disease risk comes from individual behavior change. So people need to wash their hands, they need to wash their vegetables. And as far as individual behavior change for the environment, they need to think a bit more before they take action and agree to, say, lease their land for logging or mining concession. And there's also work that can be done in certain diseases like typhoid for improving immunity. When we've presented this to donors in the past or other public health specialists, they say, well, typhoid, that's something that there's a vaccine for, so that's easy. But the issue that's been in Fiji is that it's hard to keep, you have to keep the typhoid vaccines cold, and it's hard to keep that cold chain, especially in the rural areas in Fiji. And the government hasn't funded regular typhoid vaccination campaigns. There's only been one since I've been in Fiji, and it didn't work because the vaccines weren't cold in a lot of the areas. So what we have finally gotten some money to do, not from a single donor, from two donors that Aaron and I were able to pool together and implement projects in the same geography, is try to combine this systems approach to watershed management through this project that we're calling Watershed Interventions for Systems Health in Fiji, which is really we're selling it as a preventative medicine approach. We're trying to take action before you have problems, either to the downstream environment or these disease outbreaks. So Aaron and his colleagues were able to get funding from the Australian government. With WCS, we were able to leverage money from Bloomberg Philanthropies Vibrant Oceans Initiative. And we are implementing this project stacked in 5 watersheds in Fiji right now, with the goal to reduce the incidence of water-related diseases in people, but also downstream in coral, as indicative of protecting the whole downstream marine environment. There's a whole number of other objectives that we're trying to achieve with this as well, in terms of empowering communities to their fundamental right to clean water, to strengthen these cultural connections to place and stewardship over the environment, to improve the health surveillance. And then ultimately, what we'd like to do is for this to not just rest as this is a pilot. Okay, that was nice, the funding's over, now go back to however things were in the past. But we've managed now, right now in the stage of negotiating a financing agreement to scale this up in Fiji, as well as to Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, not so it's just pilot site-based implementation focuses, but really trying to think about and do with some modeling and some economic assessment, well, how much risk are we reducing through this suite of interventions, both environmental and water and sanitation infrastructure? And then how much does that save the government? Because the government in all 3 of these countries, they're the ones who are principally paying for the healthcare. If people show up at a rural health clinic, they don't pay any money, and they don't pay any money for treatment. It's the government that ends up covering that. So if you can build a business plan around that and say that this is a cost-effective approach, that's a way to potentially mainstream this practice. If we can look at developing some sustainable finance mechanisms. So for example, in Papua New Guinea, we're already working with the government to establish a national biodiversity and climate trust fund. So we'd be looking at opening an investment window for integrated watershed management, so you can get ahead of these problems before they happen. But what we've been doing in Fiji through the WISH project is we've we've collected a lot of baseline information about the condition of all these watersheds and the downstream environment. We've been taking that information back to local communities, but also you have to communicate with messages that people can understand. And a lot of times it's better to do it pictorially. So we've worked with the communications organization to produce these graphics for us to help tell the story about why and how these activities that people do on the land are affecting both the environment as well as their downstream health. So this picture is showing a bit more of the environmental impact side. And then this talks about, if you have poor water and sanitation infrastructure, how that can directly lead to disease. Through these discussions, then we work with each of these communities to develop these water and sanitation safety plans. And then that helps to lead to a prioritization based on the data that are collected about the condition, but also what the community members are prioritizing themselves and their needs into different types of investments within the watershed. So we're doing some infrastructure investments, like here we helped install this new water tank, which is supplying piped water, clean piped water to downstream communities. And like I said, we're also looking at forest protection and restoration on the nature-based solution side of things. So, I mean, this is all project has been quite timely as we've been sitting in the middle of a global pandemic for 2 years, because a lot of information has been coming out that's linking changing of intact forests and clearing of intact forests to the emergence of infectious diseases, particularly zoonotic diseases. And so this has been a boost really to us in terms of changing the mindset of funders, and that this is not just important to protect coral reefs. I'm glad that there are a lot of donors who do just want to do land-based management to protect coral reefs, but also there are urgent reasons to also looking at maintaining forest integrity and ecosystem integrity on the land to protect people as well. And where we can get these co-benefits for nature and people is where we're going to have essentially the best bang for our buck in terms of investment. So I'm going to stop there. There have been tons of people who have been involved in these projects along the way. So I'd just like to acknowledge that we've had lots of different collaborators in Fiji, in Melanesia, and then prior in Australia, and currently in Australia on this. But thank you very much. And I'm very happy to chat with you more about this and take any questions.
Awesome. People are clapping, I'm sure. Strange moment of quiet after a great talk. Thank you. That was outstanding. Really good. Let's open it up to questions. Paulina, you're moderating, but I want to ask a question.
Go ahead, and I encourage everyone else to, I think you're able to use the chat now, so feel free to put questions in there if you don't want to say them out loud. Go ahead, Greg.
I just have, Stacy, what's your experience? I'm going to try and make this a simple question about a complex problem. This idea of keeping lands forested and managing land for water quality, people, and reef, absolutely true everywhere that we think about these problems. What's your experience in Fiji with dealing with the concept of managing land over the long term, but because of episodic events like storms? I feel like there's this huge disconnect for land developers who want to do things on land, but aren't thinking about the extreme events. Do you have any experiences there you could share?
Yeah, I mean, sort of. It's definitely, it's living in the Pacific. It is always on the forefront of your mind because, especially even just within the last few years, we've experienced 3 Category 5 cyclones just that have hit Fiji alone, and they have devastating impacts. So, I think we talk a lot about the potential for more intact ecosystems to help buffer impacts from storms. I think there's a threshold effect over which it doesn't matter anymore. A Category 5 is going to do its damage regardless if you have intact forests and mangroves and reef, not. But for smaller storms, I think there is justification for that. And we have a proposal in right now to NSF to be able to look at that and see if we can actually show some evidence that places that have had more intact ecosystems were less affected from the storms. But it's complex because it very much has to do with what side of the island they are on, whether they were getting the direct hit or not, what's the island sheltering effect and all these sorts of things. So we think about it, but there's not a lot of evidence to make that link yet.
And there's no local or regional or national policy pathway to deal with land development with respect to extreme climate events? Or is there anything like that that's going on in the background at the government level?
Not yet, no. I mean, I'm sure people are thinking about it. Climate policies are rapidly, if they haven't already been developed in the Pacific Islands. They don't have things here like relocation policies, which I know they have in Hawaii, which is pretty important. And you know, when I talk to government, I get them to maybe start thinking about those sorts of things. But because most of the land is indigenous land, they really can't tell people what to do because it's their decision. It's not government land, right? And the government only owns up to the high tide mark, technically.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Sure, you have some. Go ahead, Bree.
Thanks, Stacy. It's nice to hear your presentation and see you again. I've done a lot of thought around behavior change, and I love that you brought that up in a couple different instances. One being with, you know, trying to connect with them on the food scarcity idea of like upstream and what happens downstream. And then again, when you were talking about how you use the cartoons and then, you know, to try to reach the family. And then lastly, you went from like food scarcity to like, okay, well, it also creates disease. So how does that communication, like, have you seen a more of like an effect with your messaging towards the local community at this level, or is it still kind of not, I don't know, is there some positive work around that, or is it still kind of like not connecting with the local population?
Yeah, I think the health connections really make it stick. And that's what is inspiring people to take action. It also definitely helps that we have come with a bucket of money that can help with infrastructure improvements, so that we're not just saying it and then it's like, oh, well, then what? But we actually have tangible resources that we can put into pinpointing what the problems are and fixing it. But yeah, the fish weren't motivating people. No, the disease, typhoid, lepto, it does, yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of those people are like renting their land out for like upstream kind of
logging mostly and mining.
And so
in some
when you
places.
come in with like money and help with other projects, is that really kind of what the most successfully?
Yeah, I mean, there's a scale issue ultimately though. So for example, one of the watersheds here, there's a quarry upstream for gravel, and we think is causing pretty extreme downstream impacts. It's hard to say because you can't really separate what's coming out of that particular small catchment pour point from the adjacent catchments either, because they're all feeding onto the same reefs. But so, you know, fixing the septic tanks or toilets in one village, it's a small thing that you can do, and that'll help a little bit, and maybe with disease risk, but that alone is not going to stop the impacts from this quarry upstream. So that is going to probably require more kind of policy levers. And I mean, from what I understand, the quarry hasn't been operating fully legally. So that requires a different approach to put a stop order on what they're doing.
I see. Need some environmental lawyers. Thank you.
Hi, Stacy. Thank you so much for the great talk. So I just have one question. So you mentioned some sediments caused by the commercial logging. So how do you quantify that proportion? So how do you know how many sediments actually come from commercial logging, or any method? Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is we don't, and you would never want to present. So we have models that simulate, using packages like Invest, that there aren't the specific parameters that have been derived in terms of like soil erosivity from Fiji. So it has to be borrowed from somewhere else. And we try to borrow these parameters from, similar environments like Hawaii, where this has been calculated. So you can estimate based on different factors about what the downstream sediment loads would be. We can't necessarily pinpoint them to specific activities depending on whatever scale the model's operating on. And then these models they also miss really important contributors to sedimentation. So huge amount of sedimentation in Fiji and other high islands actually comes from riverbank slips and land slips. And that's not included in these models. And it may be up to 50% of the loads that are actually coming from the slips that aren't included. So I would say that whatever the loads calculated are probably a vast underestimate of what's coming down.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mark?
Hi, thank you very much, Stacy. I'm in the School of Public Affairs here at Arizona State University. Thanks for an interesting talk, and I have just a couple of questions. One is, earlier in your talk, you were discussing sort of the issues of land and sea control and how that's vested in the same person very often, or and these sort of ownership rights or control rights. And it seemed like you were leaning towards that's an advantage, but I could imagine that that could also be a disadvantage. And so I wonder if you could talk about that, because how that system is set up matters a lot for, I think, how generalizable some of your interventions and your findings and everything is to other places that don't have that kind of system.
Yeah, absolutely. So land tenure is generally at the level of a landowning clan in Melanesia. In Fiji, under the British colonial government, they actually went out and mapped the boundaries. So there's legally demarcated boundaries that show where these tenure blocks are. Now, it's definitely debatable whether those were the original right boundaries. And in fact, it was a very British thing to do, to assign singular rights to a single group, because in fact, within Melanesian societies, people have ownership rights, but also kind of secondary use rights in other places. And in places like in Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, where it hasn't been mapped, the ownership is often ascribed to who can trace themselves back, their genealogy back, and who can name the sacred places. And so in this context, in Fiji, where things are clearly mapped out and customary tenure systems are still quite strong, there is very good collective decision-making. And so it's less likely that some individual from a landowning group would somehow make an arrangement with a logging company or a mining company that didn't have full consultation and consensus from the rest of the landowning group, and they're able to keep each other in check. This does happen, though, all the time in Solomons and Papua New Guinea, especially because a lot of those kind of more elders or powerful figures within the landowning groups are based in the capital, and they're having these conversations. They don't go back to consult with the landowners. So when it's a functioning system, it's very strong. When the customary governance systems are eroded, it's incredibly vulnerable to these bad actors. But in terms of the transferability to, a place where, let's just say in California or in Hawaii, where you have lots of different private ownership lots, it's pretty hard to get collective agreement on action from lots of, small landholders. Yeah.
Right. And so you think that it would be quite interesting to sort of think about solutions also as governance solutions to systems like yours, so that, I know it's difficult if the system is based on naming, particular landforms or what have you, and this sort of ancestry, but also I think that's some mechanism of generating a sense of commons that I think is also a really important sort of element of what you're talking about, where you're trying to get people to realize these sort of the butterfly effect. And that's really hard to do if they're not sort of seeing the broader connectivity on a sort of an authority and control perspective, broader decision-making perspective too.
Yeah, so in other contexts, so it's talked about different types of incentivizing actions, like through payment for ecosystem services. So if you have downstream users of the water or the fisheries thinking about, what if they can pay for upstream management. And there have been water funds that have been set up in different parts of the world to help with that kind of user pay system to help fund the upstream management.
Other questions from the group? Great.
I was trying to find the hand icon. Stacy, I have one more question. It's kind of technical, but it's not meant to be answered technically. It's really, unless you want to, it's really me thinking about a problem I keep seeing, which is affects community buy-in or a lack thereof, and that is how much is known about the role of groundwater in these issues in Fiji or Melanesia. It's more obvious when it's a landslide or a river, a muddy river, or pollutants running out of an outhouse. But are you dealing with groundwater and not just?
Yeah, I keep asking.
Really hard, but
no, I know. I keep asking, what about groundwater? What about groundwater? And it's just a big black box. It's unknown in terms of what those impacts are here, because no one's really looking at it. I've seen great work in Hawaii looking at like those groundwater cells. But we have seen out on the reef, particularly in Kumlau, there's these kind of holes in the reef. And I had John Pandolfi look at an image and said, what do you think? And he said, it's probably groundwater that is bubbled up, which suggests that there definitely could be bigger issues with most of the houses have, if they have a toilet, it's in what they call a septic, but it's just like a leaky bucket that, that never gets dumped. And so that's going to be leaking, and that's going to go down through the groundwater, especially in these coastal villages, and for sure would percolate up in the marine environment. So I think it's probably a big unstudied issue.
Yeah, I've been going to these coffee association meetings, and I've learned that and I'm here on the Kona coast, and coffee is the third most agrochemically driven crop on Earth. And less than 2% of growers on Kona coast are organic. So I'm kind of learning about really big issues like that. And do people lease out their land for ag like that in Fiji or Melanesia?
Yeah, there's lots of sugarcane in Fiji, and lots of unregulated fertilizer and pesticides just dumped on the sugarcane lands for sure. In PNG and Solomons, it might be more oil palm. That's the big issue there.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Mary?
My turn. Okay. Hi, Stacy. Thank you so much for your talk. Super inspirational work. And so fun to see it all summarized like that. So thank you for sharing. I was really struck by one point you made when you were talking about the logging study, I believe, that you showed the kind of strong connection to the fisheries and fisheries catch in particular. We have these discussions all the time with fishermen here in Hawaii about, why should they be the subject of management actions when it's all things happening on land, and kind of giving us an opportunity to have conversations about, trade-offs and compromises and kind of collective action towards multiple issues. And so I was just wondering if you've had any success in kind of leveraging the effects on fisheries to motivate land-based actions, or vice versa. I guess mainly the one direction there, but yeah, just kind of has any of the efforts or influence of the impacts on fisheries actually helped motivate land-based change?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, presenting the information about the fish has been less successful than presenting the potential health impacts. The other thing just to realize too is that while there may be these impacts on the fishery and the coral reef themselves, the biggest impacts on the fishery is actually from fishing. So that requires a whole other set of management that's not even dealt with in these conversations, but we are dealing with that simultaneously.
Indeed. Yep. Yeah. I think we're in the same tactic, and
Yeah.
just showing good faith that while we're talking about these fisheries actions, we're also participating in the conversations on the land-based decision making to like have, it's just some good faith with the fishermen. But that's the best we've been able to do so far. So cool. Thank you.
Any last questions?
Yeah, I'll have another question if I can.
Sure.
I'd like to know a little bit about the landscape of other people like you there. Are you sort of, and your team and the people that you listed, are they sort of working with a bunch of others, working against a bunch of others? Are there international organizations that are driving certain things that are completely contrary to your approach? I mean, what is the sort of, I don't know, international sort of policy landscape like on Fiji or on one of the places that you're working on, and is that a problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So Fiji is really unique in that a lot of the different players are co-located in the capital in Suva. And so all the different government ministries, you have regional organizations like the Secretary of the Pacific Environment Program, the Pacific Community. Then, on the health side, there's WHO, there's UNICEF. And so you can call a meeting and everyone can actually come to it. And in fact, the government calls meetings routinely, like 10 minutes from the meeting, and you're still able to go. So that's one factor that means that in Fiji, you can have a lot more dialogue with people and get on the same page. I think it's harder in places like Solomons and PNG, where it's remote and very expensive to have these kind of regular conversations. If you're not sitting in the capital where things are happening. But at the same time, in all of these countries, on the policy level, it's ultimately the government's decision-making about enacting policy, and then it's the government who implements that policy. And there's not a lot of resources on the environment side or fisheries or inshore fishery side. I would say there's a lot of offshore fisheries resources to be able to implement regulation. So while in all of these countries, some very good legislation and regulations have been passed, there's almost zero capacity to implement in remote rural areas, those regulations. So you're kind of subject to working with local communities and them coming up with either the same rules or more stringent rules than what's in the national regulations, and working on local compliance of those to make things happen. But in terms of, are we for or against each other? I mean, I think there's not big conflict. Like, it's not like the NGOs have to be environmental advocates pushing against the government. We're not really combative against each other. Just there's a lot of inaction sometimes on the government side. It's particularly now with everyone's just distracted with COVID relief and recovery.
Maybe one last quick question, Bree.
I'll try to make it quick. So it's kind of looking forward. You said your next is Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. How do you decide where to work, what local communities? And I saw the geospatial map, so I have another question on that. But anyways, I'll just leave it.
Yeah, well, there's a new funding initiative for the Pacific. It's called the Kiwa Initiative. It's largely French development funding, but also EU and Australian, New Zealand, Canada government. So we're working on the financing agreement right now, but we would be the first regional project. And with this kind of big multilateral government donor funding, you have to bring some level of co-financing to it. And so that necessarily restricts geographically where you're going to be working, because you already have to have some money to work there. So it's in places where we already have longstanding relationships with communities and local partners on the ground. And in PNG, that's Manus Island, and in Solomon's Kalamungra still. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Excellent. Greg, did you want to say any final words?
No, I would just want to extra thank you, Stacy, for doing this. I really appreciate it. I'm sure everybody learned a lot. I learned a huge amount. And thanks for being our last speaker for the year. Really, you really got a home run out of this with us, and it was a great way to end our semester. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I should say, we're really looking forward to the water quality product from the Allen Coral Atlas that Greg and team are working on, because I think that's really going to help with a lot of this in terms of monitoring. So thank you.
Glad to hear that. We'll be talking more soon, I'm sure. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.